The sun dipped low over the Wyoming horizon, its last golden rays slanting across the parched field that had once been green before the drought stole the color from the land. A breeze rolled through the brittle grass, whispering secrets from a time before hardship, before hunger, before heartache. Clara Evans stood with her back to the barn, a broken fence gate creaking behind her, her arms full with the weight of her youngest daughter Hazel, whose head lolled sleepily against her chest. Ruth clung to her skirts, her wide, solemn eyes darting between her mother and the stranger who had just appeared like a ghost from the dying day. Ivy, barely 6, stood to the side, her small hands balled into fists, her posture mimicking her mother's defiant stance. They were all that remained of a once hopeful family. Clara's husband Samuel had gone west in search of work and died in the wilderness, his body returned weeks later by a passing cattle driver. She had buried him with her own hands in the dry ground near the barn and told the girls he had gone to heaven. Since then, every day had been a battle to survive. They scrounged from the fields, begged from suspicious neighbors, and went to bed with empty bellies. Still, Clara kept her chin high, her heart guarded. Now, before them stood a man, broad-shouldered and taller than most, backlit by the low sun, framed by the sagging gate and the weathered beams of the barn. His coat flapped gently in the breeze, a long duster of faded brown leather, and his hat cast a long shadow over a square jaw and steely eyes. He was dusted with trail dirt, but every part of him breathed control and strength. He didn't speak immediately. He just watched them, his gaze not invasive, not judgmental, but present. It unsettled Clara more than open hostility would have. "You Clara Evans?" he asked at last, his voice deep, quiet, but commanding. It rolled over the ground like distant thunder. Clara adjusted Hazel in her arms, tightening her grip. "Who wants to know?" "Will Thorne," he said simply, stepping forward. "Your husband worked for me." Clara blinked. She had heard the name in snatches over the firelight in Samuel's worn voice. The Thorne Ranch was legend among hired men. Will Thorne, the owner, was said to be half mountain, half shadow. A man who carved an empire from stone and silence. Samuel had spoken of him with envy, maybe fear. "You came all this way just to tell me that—" Will didn't flinch. "He owed me months of work. Never finished the job. I came to see what was left." Clara stiffened. "We have nothing to give." He looked at the girls, then back at her. "I can see that. I ain't here to take nothing that isn't freely given." Ruth whimpered, shrinking behind her. Clara knelt and put Hazel down, shifting her weight to her other hip. "We don't need charity. It ain't charity if it's earned." "What are you offering then?" "Room, food, work." Her suspicion flared sharper than ever. "Why?" Will didn't answer right away. He removed his hat, revealing hair the color of dust and silver brushed back from his brow. He looked tired, not just from the road, but from years that had carved his soul into something that didn't bend easily. "Because there's too much land and not enough hands," he finally said. "Because your man made a promise, and because I don't like the look of children going hungry." She looked at him long and hard. Ivy was shivering beside her. Hazel had already curled up in the dirt, too tired to care. Clara drew in a breath that tasted like dust and pride. "You have room for us. I have a bunkhouse. Not much, but it's dry, warm, and locks on the door." He nodded once. "If that's what you want." She stepped back, took Ivy's hand, and lifted Hazel again. "Then we'll come, but just until the season turns." Will tipped his hat in quiet agreement. "Get what you need. I've got a wagon." The ride to Thorne Ranch was long and silent. Clara sat in the back of the wagon among feed sacks and old tools, holding her girls close. The land rolled by in shades of gold and shadow. The horizon stretched wide and unreachable, and the silence between her and Will was heavy, but not cruel. It was the silence of people who had seen too much to waste words. The girls fell asleep along the way. Ruth clutched a piece of cloth she called her doll. Ivy curled up against Clara's side. Hazel snored softly. Clara watched Will from the corner of her eye. He handled the reins like a man used to leading without asking. His movements were efficient, practiced. She noticed the way he checked the road ahead constantly, the way he scanned the hills like he didn't trust them. A man like that had made enemies, or lost too many friends. "You doing all right?" he asked, not turning. "We're still breathing." "That ain't what I asked." She met his eyes when he finally glanced over his shoulder. "I don't complain." He nodded as if that was answer enough. They reached the ranch just after twilight. The house rose out of the land like something solid and ancient. It wasn't grand, but it was well-kept, broad-porched with lamps glowing in the windows. Several outbuildings stood nearby, a barn, a smokehouse, a shed. In the distance, horses grazed. Will stopped the wagon beside a squat, narrow building. "This used to be the cookhouse. You can stay here." Clara climbed down and helped her daughters out, her legs stiff. The cookhouse was small but clean. It had a stove, a wash basin, a table, and a bed that would just fit the four of them. "There's wood stacked outside," Will said. "I'll bring more in the morning." She hesitated before speaking. "You said there'd be a lock." "I'll fix one tonight." She nodded. "Thank you." Will turned to go, then stopped. "You'll start work after sunup. House chores mostly. Might need help with the garden, too. I'll earn our place." Didn't doubt it. That night, Clara watched her daughters sleep. The stew Will had brought, a thick rabbit and root broth, sat warm in their bellies. Their cheeks were pink with heat for the first time in weeks. Ruth smiled in her sleep. Hazel curled against her side. Ivy whispered, "Are we safe now, Mama?" Clara kissed her forehead. "For now, baby. For now." When the wind picked up outside, Clara stepped out onto the porch. The stars above seemed impossibly close. The air smelled like hay and earth. She leaned against the post, drawing her shawl tighter. Boot steps on gravel. She turned to see Will approaching. He stopped a few paces away. "Lock's on the door," he said. "Thank you. You'll be all right here. I'll see to that." She looked at him, eyes wary. "Why?" He hesitated. Then, "Because someone didn't do right by you. I aim to fix what I can." Clara studied him under starlight. She didn't trust easily, but she knew this much: he hadn't looked at her with pity. He hadn't looked at her like she was weak. "I'll work hard," she said. "Just don't expect me to break." Will offered a rare faint smile. "Didn't figure you would." They stood in silence a moment longer. Two strangers bound by something unspoken, lost pride and a need for second chances. Then Will tipped his hat and walked back into the dark. Clara watched him go, then turned and slipped back inside. For the first time in months, she locked the door not out of fear, but for peace. And outside, the land slept quiet and vast, waiting to see what the morning would bring. The morning sun broke over the horizon in a warm blaze, stretching golden fingers across the wide Wyoming plain. Clara awoke to the muffled sounds of horses in the nearby barn and the scent of dew-soaked earth. She shifted beneath the quilt, momentarily forgetting where she was, until the sound of her daughters breathing softly around her grounded her again. They were safe, for now. She turned her head slightly and saw the wooden beams of the barn loft where Jim Cutter had set them up for the night. He had insisted they take the hayloft while he slept downstairs in the stable. Despite the unfamiliar surroundings and 1,000 questions burning in her mind, Clara had slept better than she had in weeks. A rooster crowed somewhere outside. Clara sat up quietly, her back sore from days of walking and stress. The girls stirred beside her. Annie was curled tightly against her side, her thumb still in her mouth. Rosie lay on her belly face, half buried in a makeshift pillow of folded burlap. Lily, the eldest, was already awake, her wide eyes watching Clara. "Mama," she whispered, brushing her tangled hair away from her face. "Is this place safe?" Clara nodded, placing a finger gently to her lips. "For now, baby, we're going to be okay." They descended the ladder quietly. Clara's eyes adjusted to the low light in the stable where the big bay horse was munching hay, and Jim was already at work. He wore a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled up and a brown vest, his cowboy hat shading his face as he cleaned out a stall. He looked up when he heard them. "Morning," he said softly, voice like warm gravel. Clara gave him a cautious smile. "Thank you for letting us stay." He nodded toward the table near the wall where he had placed a tin pot and a few biscuits wrapped in a clean cloth. "Coffee's hot. Food's not much, but it's something." Clara felt a pang of humility. "It's more than we had yesterday. Thank you." The girls gathered around the biscuits, grateful and hungry. Jim poured coffee into 2 chipped enamel cups and handed one to Clara. "You all from the East?" he asked as he leaned against a post. "Georgia," Clara replied, wrapping both hands around the warm tin. "We came west with my husband 2 years ago, chasing work and land. But after he passed," Jim waited, his expression unreadable. "He caught pneumonia in the mountains last winter," she said. "I tried to keep him warm, but there wasn't enough food. After he died, we had to leave the homestead. There was nothing left." Jim glanced at the girls, then back at Clara. "No family." She shook her head. "No one who'd take us in. I was trying to reach a mining town in the north. Thought maybe I could find work sewing or cleaning, but I lost the trail." Jim pushed off the post. "You walked far." Clara nodded. "Days, maybe more. I lost count." He paused, jaw clenched. Then he motioned toward the barn door. "Come on, let me show you the place." Outside, the morning air was crisp. Clara stepped into the sunlight, grateful for its warmth. The ranch stretched out in all directions, fenced pastures, a small stream to the west, chickens scratching near the coop, and a cabin tucked beyond the barn. Smoke curled from its stone chimney. Jim gestured toward the house. "That's where I live. Built it myself after my wife passed." Clara's heart ached. "You were married." Jim nodded. 5 years. She died giving birth. The baby, too. Clara swallowed hard. Loss had a way of recognizing itself in others. "I never remarried," he said, his voice distant. "Didn't see the point. I work the land, keep to myself." Clara looked at the strong lines of his face. His quiet solitude wrapped around him like armor. "That's a lonely life." Jim shrugged. "Better than burying more folks I care about." Silence stretched between them until Rosie came bounding out of the barn chasing a chicken. Jim chuckled under his breath. Clara smiled for the first time in days. "You're welcome to stay," he said quietly, "just until you figure your next move. There's a spare room in the cabin. Warmer than the barn." Clara blinked, surprised. "You'd let us live in your home." "It's just me out here," Jim replied. "Got more room than I need." Her instinct was to say no. She didn't trust easily, not anymore. But the girls needed warmth, food, safety. She looked toward the cabin and then at her daughters playing nearby. The decision was clear. "Thank you," she said, her voice firm. "We'll do what we can to help around the ranch." Moving into the cabin was like stepping into another life. It was modest wood walls, a stone hearth, hand-hewn furniture, but it was clean and smelled faintly of pine and saddle oil. The spare room had a straw mattress and woolen blankets. Clara laid them out for the girls, brushing their hair and singing to them as the sun sank low in the sky. Jim kept to himself most of the day, tending to cattle and repairing the fence out back. Clara offered to cook supper cornbread and beans, simple but filling. She chopped onions while Lily fetched water from the stream and Annie and Rosie gathered kindling. As the fire crackled in the hearth and the scent of onions filled the cabin, Clara allowed herself a moment to breathe, to imagine, even briefly, that they were safe. At supper, Jim ate in silence while the girls chattered around the table. Rosie tried to feed the dog under the table. Annie spilled her milk twice. Jim said nothing, but a faint smile tugged at his mouth. After the girls were asleep, Clara stepped outside onto the porch. The stars blanketed the sky in glittering silence. Jim stood nearby, arms folded, watching the night. "It's peaceful out here," Clara said. "Most nights," he replied. She hesitated. "I still don't understand why you're helping us." Jim looked at her, eyes steady. "Because someone helped me once when I was at my lowest. Figured I'd return the favor someday." Clara nodded slowly. "You don't have to do this alone, you know. Living out here carrying your pain." He didn't reply at first. Then he said quietly, "Neither do you." The words hung between them like something sacred. Clara turned her face to the stars, unsure of what tomorrow would bring, but knowing for the first time in a long while it might hold hope. Morning came quietly to the Cutter Ranch, with mist rising off the dew-laden fields and the muffled cluck of hens beginning their fuss. Clara stood at the kitchen basin, sleeves rolled up, washing the breakfast tin plates with cool water drawn from the stream. The girls were outside chasing butterflies through the tall grass, their laughter drifting through the open cabin window like music Clara hadn't heard in years. Inside it smelled of cornbread, coffee, and pine. Home in a way that hadn't felt possible since Thomas died. She turned when she heard the creak of boots on wood. Jim Cutter stepped through the door with a coil of rope over one shoulder hat tucked under his arm and a line of dust along his jaw. His shirt clung to his back from the early labor. "Fence on the north line's sagging," he said simply, setting the rope by the door. "I'll need to reset 3 posts today." Clara nodded, drying her hands on a cotton cloth. "I can help if you'll let me. I've set plenty of fence in my time." He blinked, surprised. "You know how to dig post holes." "I do," she said with a quiet smile. Thomas didn't believe in hiring hands unless absolutely necessary. We worked every inch of land together. Jim rubbed his neck thoughtfully. "All right, then. I'll saddle you a horse." Clara hesitated, glancing toward the yard. "What about the girls? They can ride with us if you trust them to stay clear of the tools. I've got a blanket and basket for shade. I can fix up a shady spot under the cottonwoods." Clara looked out the window again. Lily was braiding grass into a crown for Rosie, and Annie was chasing the dog in clumsy circles. It had been days since she'd seen them look so free. "All right," she said softly, "let's ride." By mid-morning, they were all on horseback, a strange little procession. Clara riding Jim's smaller mare with Annie perched in front of her. Lily and Rosie sharing a pack horse under Clara's watchful eye, and Jim in the lead with tools strapped across the saddle horn. The northern edge of the property stretched into a gently rising hill framed by low brush and golden grass. They stopped near a half-collapsed section of fence where a cow grazed unconcerned just outside the boundary. Jim dismounted and pulled the post-hole digger from the leather pack. "Reckon that steer's making a mockery of me," he muttered. Clara laughed under her breath. "He looks mighty pleased with himself." They worked side by side. Jim dug deep holes while Clara held the posts steady and packed the earth back in around them with a boot and a tamping stick. Her hands, though tired, remembered the rhythm. The air filled with the sounds of shovels clinking wood, creaking, and the occasional shout from the girls playing near the creek. Jim paused once to glance at her hands. Blisters. She showed him her palms already red but not torn. Calluses never left. He nodded admiration flickering in his eyes. "You don't complain." "I don't see the point," she said. By the time they hammered in the last rail, the sun was high overhead. Jim stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. "Not bad for a morning's work," he said. Clara took a deep breath. The land smelled of hot dust and sweet grass. Sweat ran down her spine, but it was the good kind, the kind that reminded her she was still alive. As they walked back to the creek where the girls sat eating apples, Clara spoke without thinking. "It feels good to work again, to feel useful." Jim looked over. "You've always been useful, Clara. You just forgot it for a while." Her throat tightened. She didn't answer. That afternoon, back at the cabin, the girls napped in the shade while Clara washed clothes in a tin tub. Jim repaired a broken axle on the supply cart. The quiet between them was easy, no longer taut with wariness. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Jim brought over a small wooden box and set it on the porch steps beside Clara. "What's this?" she asked. He opened the lid. Inside were old tools, odd bits of metal spools of thread, 2 worn thimbles, and a folded-up scrap of blue calico cloth. "Was hers," Jim said softly. "My wife. She used to mend everything with that old kit. Can't bear to throw it out, but I thought maybe it'd be of use to you." Clara reached out and touched the fabric gently. "Thank you." "She was good at stitching, same as you," Jim added. "Used to make shirts for the neighbor boys just for something to do. Always said idle hands were the devil's plaything." Clara smiled faintly. "Your wife sounds like she was a strong woman." "She was. Fierce, too. Would have liked you, I think." There was a long pause, and then Clara asked, "Do you miss her?" He nodded slowly. "Every day. But the grief doesn't crush like it used to. These days it's more like a shadow, always there, just not heavy." Clara stared out at the horizon where the sun painted the sky in copper and gold. "That's how I want it to be someday. Right now, it still feels like I can't breathe without him." Jim turned toward her, his voice low. "You will. It just takes time, and maybe a little help from someone who understands." Clara's eyes filled, but she blinked them clear. She would not cry. Not now. Later that night, the girls slept soundly, curled up under the quilt Clara had pieced together during the worst winter. She stepped outside to find Jim once again on the porch, sitting with a mug in his hand, the stars above him like fireflies caught in a jar. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. "Just thinking." Clara sat down beside him. "About what?" He hesitated, then said that maybe I was wrong about living out here alone. "I thought it was easier, but easier ain't the same as better." Clara looked at him, the glow from the lantern catching the lines around his eyes. "You've been alone a long time, haven't you?" "Too long," he said. "I forgot what a full house sounds like. Forgot how good it feels to hear laughter in the yard again." A gentle breeze stirred the prairie grass. In the distance, an owl hooted from a cottonwood. "I don't know what comes next for me and the girls," Clara said quietly, "but if it's here, I think I'd be grateful for that." Jim looked at her for a long moment. "There's no rush, but just know there's room for you here. Not just under my roof. In my life, too." Clara's breath caught. She looked away, then back. "That's a mighty generous thing to say. It's not charity, Clara. It's hope." And just like that, something shifted, like the first crack of spring thaw after a long winter. Not love, not yet, but trust. And that was the beginning of something far more powerful. The wind had picked up that morning, rattling the branches of the cottonwoods and carrying the scent of dust and sagebrush through the valley. It was the kind of wind that made a woman's nerves stir beneath her skin, though the sky stayed a steady, cloudless blue. Clara was behind the cabin, hanging laundry on the line with pinched clothespins and a rhythm born of habit. The twins' dresses fluttered beside the patched sheet, and Lizzie's apron whipped against a pillowcase like it wanted to run. Her hands moved with practiced speed, but her thoughts had drifted toward dinner, toward mending boots, toward the way Jim had smiled softly at her youngest the night before. Then she heard it, a sound beneath the wind, steady, distant, hoofbeats. She paused, one clothespin halfway to the line. At first, she thought it might have been thunder rolling somewhere beyond the ridges, but no, there was no echo, no rumble. Just the deliberate beat of hooves on dry dirt getting closer. Clara moved around the cabin, wiping her hands on her skirt, squinting down the long trail that led up to their property. A lone figure rode in silhouetted against the rising sun. Tall, and the saddle back straight. Even from here, she could tell something wasn't right. It wasn't the way a neighbor rode in to chat. It wasn't the sheriff. It wasn't Jim, either. He was just then emerging from the barn wrench in hand, his face going tight as he saw her expression. She whispered, "Someone's coming." Jim didn't ask who. He turned, set down the wrench, and reached for his rifle leaning beside the barn door. The rider came into view fully, now dust swirling around his horse's legs, brown coat flapping, a black hat pulled low, a pistol resting easy on one hip, one hand holding the reins loosely, while the other rested near the weapon. Jim narrowed his eyes, stepping forward to meet the man as he drew closer. Clara stood a few paces behind him, heart thudding in her chest. Then she saw the man's face, and her heart dropped like a stone. "Miles Bricker," she whispered. It was a name she hadn't spoken in months, a name she'd hoped she'd never hear again. Miles had worked with her late husband during the final miserable year of their marriage. Drank too much, had a mouth full of filth, and after Thomas's death, when Clara had been raw and exposed and desperate, Miles had seen her as prey. Not a widow, not a mother, just something vulnerable. He had made his intentions clear more than once, tried to corner her in town, made promises wrapped in threats, said things that stuck to her skin like oil. Now he was here in the flesh. "Well, ain't this something Miles said as he slowed his horse to a halt just outside the fence? Didn't expect to find you playing house with a cowpoke?" Jim's grip on his rifle tightened, but he didn't raise it. Not yet. Clara forced herself to stand tall. "You've got no right to be here." Miles ignored her and looked at Jim. "You must be the hired man. I'm the man who lives here," Jim said, voice even. "State your business." Miles spat into the dirt. "I come to collect." Thomas died with his pockets empty and his debts wide open. Some men don't forget things like that. Turns out his pretty widow ran out before anyone could collect on what's owed. "I owe you nothing," Clara snapped, stepping beside Jim. "My husband's debts died with him." Miles's eyes flicked over her with a leer that made her want to scrub her skin raw. "You think the world works like that, sweetheart? There's folks paying good coin for someone who can bring you back to answer for what he owed. And me, I like coin." Jim took one deliberate step forward. "You come here looking to make threats on this land, you best think twice." Miles gave a sharp, humorless laugh. "Easy, cowboy. I ain't drawn. Yet." His eyes never left Clara. "You always were proud. Thought you were better than a man like me. That pretty mouth always saying no while your eyes said something else." Before Jim could speak, Clara's voice rang out firm, cold. "Leave." Miles tilted his head. "This ain't over. You can play at being safe out here, but there's a lot of land between you and the law, and I ain't the only one sniffing round." He tugged his reins, turned his horse, and rode back the way he came. The sound of hooves faded, but the tension remained, wrapped tight around the cabin like a noose. That night, the house felt smaller. The girls went to bed early, but Clara barely heard their giggles. She sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee. Jim sat across from her, the fire behind him, casting long shadows across his face. "You should have told me," he said gently. "About him, about the debts." She shook her head. "I wanted to leave it behind. I didn't think he'd find me." Jim nodded slowly. "You knew the kind of man he was." "Yes." Her voice cracked. "After Thomas died, Miles came sniffing around like a vulture. Said I could pay off the debt in ways that didn't require money. When I refused, he made threats. Subtle at first, then more direct. I found a note on my door. Said my girls might not be so lucky if I kept being stubborn." Jim looked sick. "I packed everything I could carry," Clara continued, "and I ran. I didn't look back." Silence fell between them. Then Jim said, "You're not running this time." She looked up. "What makes you so sure?" "Because you've got someone standing beside you now." His words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They fell into her like rain on dry earth. "I won't let him lay a finger on you," Jim added. "On any of you." Clara blinked fast. Her chest ached, but not from fear. From the weight of being seen, protected. The next day, Jim took action. He reinforced the front and back doors with iron brackets, boarded up the windows from the inside, taught Clara how to hold the shotgun steady, how to brace her feet and aim from the shoulder. "You won't need it," he said quietly, "but just in case." Clara nodded. Her hands shook the first time she held the gun. But by the third try, she was hid in the center of the post he'd marked with charcoal. By sunset, they were both exhausted, but safer. That evening, Clara stood on the porch shotgun resting against the rail. The horizon stretched out like a painted golden hills, distant ridgelines, a windmill spinning lazily. Jim came up beside her. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked, eyes still on the land. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I remember it's the first place I ever felt peace." Clara turned to him. "You've given us that. You've given me that." He hesitated, then reached for her hand, just lightly, just enough for her fingers to feel his calluses and strength. "You don't owe me anything, Clara," he said, "but I'll fight for you just the same." She swallowed, her chest tightening. "I know," she whispered, "and I won't run any more." They stood there as the stars came out, two shadows carved in the soft light, watching the dark settle across the land. For the first time in months, Clara didn't feel like prey. She felt like something far more dangerous, a mother with something worth fighting for. And beside her, a cowboy who had already decided she was worth protecting with his life. The storm rolled over the prairie like a great beast shaking the heavens with its roar. Lightning split the sky in jagged veins, throwing white fire across the cabin's wooden walls, and thunder cracked so close it made the rafters tremble. Rain came in torrents, hammering the roof with such force it sounded like 1,000 horses galloping overhead. Inside, Clara sat stiffly by the hearth, her hands clenched in her lap. The fire snapped and hissed, trying to warm the room, but no flame could chase away the chill knotting in her stomach. She stared at the flickering logs, but her mind wasn't on the fire. It was on Miles Bricker. Even now, days after his visit, his voice echoed in her head, slimy smug, the threat in it wrapped in that fake civility of his. She could still feel his eyes like cold fingers crawling across her skin. And worst of all, she knew men like him didn't make idle threats. Her girls were asleep, all three curled together in the loft above, unaware of the danger that might still lurk on the horizon. Clara had made sure every window was bolted, the door barred, and the shotgun loaded by the stove. But it wasn't the cabin she didn't trust. It was the world outside. The wind howled louder, and the storm shifted. A loose shutter banged wildly against the window frame. Clara flinched. The sound of the front door opening made her jolt again, but it was just Jim stomping in from the barn. He was soaked through water, trailing from his coat and brimmed hat. His presence filled the room like a calming tide. Their eyes met. "I tightened the gate," he said, removing his wet coat and hanging it on the peg. Wind tried to tear it clean off the hinges. She nodded, voice caught in her throat. Jim stepped closer, the firelight gleaming off his damp shirt plastered to his chest. His boots squelched with each step, but he moved gently, like he was always aware of how much space he took up and how little space she had left to give. "You all right?" he asked, voice low. "I don't know anymore," Clara murmured. Jim pulled a chair closer, sitting beside her, but not too close, letting the space between them remain a choice. He looked into the fire with her silence stretching between them. "I keep seeing him," she admitted after a moment, "in the corner of my eye, in the dark behind the trees. I know it's in my head, but I can't stop waiting for the next knock." Jim's jaw tightened. "He's not coming back tonight. And if he does come back, he won't make it past me." Clara's throat caught. "But what if I'm not strong enough? What if I freeze when I need to fight?" "You've already fought," he said. "Every damn day since your husband died. You packed up your girls and came west with nothing but a dream and a wagon. You built a home out of bones and wood. That's more strength than most men I've known." She shook her head, tears stinging. "That strength's all worn through Jim. I don't think I have any left." He turned toward her, now fully. His eyes, those storm-gray eyes, held something steady, deep. "Then lean on me for a while." Clara's breath hitched. "You don't have to do this. I'm not your burden to carry." "I don't see you as a burden." She stared at him. "Then what am I to you?" For a long beat, he didn't answer. Then he said, "You're the reason I start smiling before I open the door. You're the voice I hear in my head when I'm fixing fence alone. You're the only one I've met who makes this ranch feel like more than a place to sleep." The thunder outside seemed to hush. Clara's lip trembled. "Jim?" He stood slowly, offering her his hand. Not taking, not pulling, just offering. She looked at it then, at his face, and something inside her finally gave way. She took it. He pulled her gently to her feet. Then, without a word, he wrapped his arms around her, and she broke. She sank into him like a woman starved for touch, for warmth, for safety. Her hands clutched his back, her head tucked under his chin. He held her with quiet strength, his arms steady and unmoving like a wall built just for her to lean on. Her tears came hot and fast, soaking into his shirt, and he never once pulled away. "It's okay," he murmured. "Let it out." For the first time in years, Clara allowed herself to be held. Not as a wife, not as a mother, not as a woman who had to be strong for everyone else, but simply as herself. A soul needing rest. And in that moment she found rest in him. They stood there for what felt like a lifetime, the storm outside fading into distant rumble. The fire popped behind them, warm and soft. When she finally pulled back, Clara looked up into his face. Her cheeks were damp, but her eyes clearer. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said. "Not so fast, not so deep." Jim brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "Neither did I. But sometimes the good things don't wait." She gave a soft, tearful laugh. "You're full of those cowboy sayings, aren't you? Only the ones that happen to be true." She looked at him for a long while. "The girls, they trust you." He nodded. So do I trust them. Clara stepped back fully, now wiping her cheeks. I need to be careful, Jim. I'll wait, he said, as long as it takes. That night, Clara went up to the loft, checking on her daughters. The twins were curled together like kittens, their breath soft and steady. Lizzie lay facing the wall, but turned over as Clara approached. Mama, she whispered. Yes, baby? I heard thunder. I thought maybe Bricker was coming. Clara's heart clenched. He's not, sweetheart. We're safe tonight. Lizzie nodded, but her eyes searched Clara's face. Jim makes it feel safer. He makes you smile again. Clara kissed her forehead. Go to sleep, darling. But she didn't deny it, because Lizzie was right. At dawn, the storm had passed. The world outside gleamed with new life puddles catching sunlight, the air cool and clean. Clara stepped out onto the porch and found Jim already saddled up, tending to a lame colt near the corral. He looked up, gave her a smile, and tipped his hat. Something bloomed in her chest then. Not love, not yet, but the promise of it. The possibility that in this wild and brutal world there was still space for tenderness, still room for hope, and maybe, just maybe, a home. Not just for her daughters, but for her heart, too. The sun had just begun to dip beyond the distant ridges, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of rose and gold. The storm was long past now, and the world had settled into that quiet, holy hour before nightfall, when the land seemed to hold its breath as if savoring its own beauty. Clara stood on the porch, her arms folded loosely over her apron, watching as Jim lifted the last of the split wood onto the pile beside the cabin. His shirt clung to his shoulders from the day's work, and strands of his hair curled damply at his neck. He moved with the kind of steady strength that didn't demand attention, but always earned it. You're going to throw your back out if you keep doing all the heavy lifting, she called, smiling. Jim looked up, one brow raised. Coming from the woman who once dragged a half-dead mule out of a ditch by herself. Clara laughed. That mule owed me 4 days of travel and a good pair of boots. He leaned his axe against the fence post and made his way toward her, brushing sawdust from his hands. Any plans tonight? Besides, trying to convince the twins that cornbread is not, in fact, dessert. They've started bartering with Lizzie. Offered her half a rabbit pelt if she gives them her molasses cookie. Smart girls, future traders. And swindlers, Clara replied, shaking her head. I don't know whether to be proud or worried. He stepped up onto the porch, his boots creaking on the boards. How about we give them something to celebrate? Clara gave him a look. What kind of something? Jim reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small hand-carved whistle shaped like a bird. What's that for? Evening surprise, he said. Come on. By the time the girls had finished supper and cleaned up their bowls, Jim had built a small fire in the clearing just beyond the fence line. The stars were beginning to prick the sky, the air soft with the scents of juniper and sage. Fireflies danced in lazy arcs through the dusk. Clara walked out hand in hand with Lizzie, while the twins skipped ahead, laughing as they chased the flickering lights. Jim stood by the fire with something tucked under his arm, an old fiddle, battered and worn, but lovingly polished. Is that? Clara asked, surprised. He nodded. Belonged to my mother. She taught me how to play before I ever learned to ride. Been a while, but I figure the notes are still in there somewhere. The girls gasped in delight. Lizzie clapped her hands. Are we having a party? Something like it, Jim said. He lifted the fiddle, tested the strings, then rested the chin rest against his shoulder. The first note was a little flat, the second wavered, but then he found the tune. A lilting frontier waltz, slow and bright, like something the wind itself might hum. Clara sat down on a low log, letting the music wrap around her. It wasn't perfect, but it was full of heart. The twins danced first, spinning in wild circles with bare feet and tangled braids. Lizzie joined, more graceful, more shy. Clara watched them, her heart swelling. She hadn't heard music like this in years. Not since before Thomas, not since Texas. Not since hope was something she dared to feel in the open. Jim's eyes met hers over the fiddle's curved neck, and for a moment the world stilled. Then he stepped forward, lowering the fiddle. "May I have this dance?" Clara blinked. "You want to dance with me?" "I do. I haven't danced since." He extended his hand, patient. "Then we'll make a new memory." Her breath caught. Clara stood slowly, placing her fingers in his palm. His hand was rough, calloused, but warm. Familiar now. He led her gently into the firelight. The girls laughing and spinning, nearby fireflies glinting like fairy sparks. Jim lifted the fiddle again, tucked it under his arm, and played a softer tune, one meant for two. When the melody settled into rhythm, he looped the strap around the fiddle and let it fall against his back. His hands returned to hers, one at her waist, the other clasping her fingers. They swayed together under the wide Wyoming sky, slow and uncertain at first, but soon falling into a quiet cadence. There was no audience but the stars, no judge but the wind. "I forgot what this felt like," Clara murmured. "What's that?" "Letting go, just being held." Jim didn't answer with words. He only pulled her slightly closer, his hand steady at the small of her back. Her cheek rested against his chest, and for a moment time dropped away. There was no past, no pain, no bricker, no fear. Just two people sharing warmth in a wild land. Clara could feel the beat of his heart. Strong, constant, real. After a while, the girls tired themselves out. The twins curled up in a quilt by the fire. Lizzie leaned against a log, her eyes half closed, humming the last of Jim's tune. Clara tucked them in gently. Jim added another log to the fire and sat beside her. "They'll remember this," she said softly. "I hope they do. I will." A silence passed between them, comfortable. Then Clara turned to face him. Her voice was quiet, unsure. "Why are you really here, Jim?" He looked at her, brow furrowed. "What do you mean? You could have ridden off weeks ago. Said it was just a favor for a neighbor. But you stayed." He paused, then said, "At first, it was the right thing to do. You needed help. The girls needed safety. And now," he looked into her eyes, "now I stay because I want to." Her breath caught again. He continued, his voice rougher now. "Clara, I've walked this earth alone for a long time. Not because I couldn't find people, but because I couldn't find this. A place that feels like something worth protecting. Someone who makes it feel like I can be more than a ranch hand with a broken past." Clara's voice trembled. "I'm not perfect, Jim. I'm scared. I've got scars you haven't even seen yet. Then we're matched just right," he said. "Because I've got my own. We'll patch each other up." She blinked fast. "You make it sound so easy. It won't be, but we'll try. One sunrise at a time." Clara hesitated, then leaned her head onto his shoulder. The fire crackled beside them, sending embers into the dark. In the hush of the frontier night, with the stars wheeling overhead, she let herself believe it could be true. That, out here, beneath the open sky, a widow and a quiet cowboy could build something new. Not just survival, but joy. The skies over the Callahan Ranch had darkened before sundown, the kind of dark that pressed against the windows like a coming storm. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the barn, her apron still damp from washing her hands, clutching a folded shawl. The wind had been strange all day, not cold, but unsettled, like something was stirring just beyond the horizon. Inside the house, the children were quiet. They had learned the silence of waiting, the stillness of not knowing what tomorrow might bring. Clara sat at the table mending a ripped sleeve while Nathan polished the boots Wade had lent him. The younger two, Lily and Sam, played with wood chips on the floor pretending they were animals in a barn. Wade had gone to town that morning and hadn't yet returned. Evelyn's nerves twisted with each hour that passed. She told herself he had probably been delayed by a wheel or some last-minute errand, but part of her knew better. Ever since Cal had come slinking around with his threats and demands, Evelyn hadn't felt a single moment of ease. Even after the court decision had ruled in her favor, naming her sole guardian of the children, she could feel the heat of Cal's resentment smoldering. She wrapped the shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the yard, scanning the dim trail that led down toward the creek. Nothing. Just the tall grass bowing to the wind. She closed her eyes, breathing in the smell of cedar and dirt, and tried to draw courage from the earth beneath her feet. When the horse finally arrived, it wasn't Wade. It was Jed Weaver. "Miss Evelyn," he called urgency in his voice as he dismounted. "You need to come quick. There's trouble. Wade's at the sheriff's station with your husband." Her heart jolted at the word. Husband. She had long ago stopped thinking of Cal as anything more than a dark chapter best left behind. But now the past had come roaring back, clawing at her hard-won peace. "Is Wade hurt?" she asked. "Not badly," Jed replied, but his face was tense. "Got roughed up a bit when they tried to take the kids by force. He stopped them. Sheriff stepped in, locked Cal up, but he won't stay quiet long." Evelyn didn't hesitate. She called Clara to watch the others and saddled a horse with Jed's help. The ride to town was a blur of pounding hooves and burning worry. When they reached the station, she found Wade sitting on a bench outside his coat, torn at the shoulder, a smear of blood at his lip. "I told you not to go alone," she said, crouching in front of him. He managed a tired smile. "You also told me I couldn't fix everything. Turns out you're right about both." She reached up and touched his cheek. "Are the children safe?" "Safer now than they were," he said. Cal tried to hand over forged documents to claim them. Sheriff Boone saw right through him. Said they didn't match what the court signed. "He won't stop," Evelyn whispered. "No," Wade agreed. "He won't, which is why I need to do something I should have done a long time ago." Evelyn blinked. "What is it?" "I want you and the kids to be part of this land, this life. Legally. Fully," he said. "Not just because you need protection, but because I need you. All of you. Not out of duty. Out of choice." Her breath caught. "Are you asking?" He nodded. "I know it ain't much of a proposal, but I'm asking if you'll marry me, Evelyn, not for papers or safety, for home." For a moment, the world went still. Even the wind seemed to hush. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking with more than just fear. "Yes, Wade Callahan." He reached into his coat and pulled out a silver ring, plain but solid. It had been his mother's. She had given it to him before she passed, saying, "A good woman will never care for gold. She'll care for the hands that offer it." He slid it on her finger. It fit like it had waited there all along. The wedding happened quietly 2 days later, under the old cottonwood tree near the creek, witnessed by the children Jed and his wife Mabel. The preacher from town came in his Sunday vest, smiling gently, as he joined their hands and spoke words of binding and belief. Evelyn wore her cleanest dress hair, pinned back with a sprig of wildflower that Clara had picked. When the vows were said and the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Wade lifted her hand to his lips. The children clapped. Sam let out a cheer, and Lily laughed so hard she fell backward into the grass. That night, the house was full of warmth, a roaring fire, the smell of roasted meat, and the kind of laughter that wrapped around the walls like a blessing. Evelyn sat by the hearth as Wade told stories of his younger days. Clara leaned into her side, Lily asleep in her lap. Even Nathan, who rarely showed affection, slipped his hand into Wade's as they said good night. Outside, the moon rose clear and silver. Inside, hearts began to believe. But peace didn't last long. Just past midnight, a knock came at the door. 3 sharp raps that sent Evelyn's pulse into her throat. Wade was already on his feet, reaching for the rifle beside the door. Evelyn moved the children into the back room, telling them not to come out unless she said. Wade opened the door to find Sheriff Boone. He escaped, the sheriff said, jaw tight. Overpowered the deputy and fled. Took a horse and some supplies. We think he's heading back this way. Wade didn't curse, didn't even blink. He simply nodded. We'll be ready. Evelyn stood behind him. We can't fight him off forever. We won't have to, Boone said. I wired the marshal in Cheyenne. With your testimony and the records, Cal's looking at federal charges. We just have to keep him from doing something reckless before the law catches up. Evelyn nodded, though fear burned in her belly. They barred the doors, stoked the fire, and kept watch. Morning came gray and wet mist clinging to the hills like ghosts. But Cal never came. For 3 days they waited. Wade and Nathan rode patrols around the perimeter. Evelyn tended the animals and tried to keep the children distracted. But each creak of the wind, each snap of a twig in the woods made them jump. Then, on the 4th night, a lantern light flickered in the distance. Wade saw it first from the barn loft. He's here, he muttered, grabbing his rifle and sounding the bell near the porch. The clang echoed across the property. Evelyn rushed the children into the storm cellar and locked the door. Cal came out of the darkness like a ghost, dirty, wild-eyed, and furious. He carried a pistol in one hand, the other clutching a sack. "Thought you could erase me," he sneered, pointing the gun at Wade. "But I'm still their father. You lost that right long ago," Wade said, rifle steady. Evelyn emerged then, standing just behind Wade. "You never were a father," she said. "Just a storm we survived." Cal raised the gun. The shot rang out, but it wasn't his. Jed Weaver had arrived just in time, firing from the tree line. Cal fell to his knees, the gun skittering away. Wade crossed the space and pinned him down as Sheriff Boone galloped up the trail. Cal was arrested, bound, and taken away under guard. As the dust settled and the stars blinked above, Evelyn sank to her knees, overwhelmed. Wade was at her side in an instant, pulling her close. She leaned into him, her tears soaking into his coat. "It's done now," he whispered. "He's gone. It doesn't feel real," she murmured. "It is. We made it." The children emerged from the cellar, blinking at the light. Clara ran to her mother, wrapping her arms around her waist. Nathan looked at Wade and nodded a silent promise. And as dawn broke across the ranch, painting the sky in the rose and gold, Evelyn knew that what had begun in silence and struggle had become something unshakable. They were a family now, bound not by blood, but by choice sacrifice and love forged through fire. And from the ashes they had built a future that would not burn. Dawn broke gently over the Wyoming sky, casting a wash of pale gold over the Callahan Ranch. The light seeped through every crack in the cabin's log walls, softening the edges of the night and warming the floor where Evelyn stood barefoot, watching the horizon. She had barely slept. The events of the past weeks circled in her mind like a flock of unsettled birds. From the first time Wade found her in that broken shelter to the moment Cal Ruhr had been taken away in chains, her world had shifted on trembling ground. But today, as the sun stretched long over the valley, Evelyn felt something she hadn't dared feel in years: hope. She glanced over her shoulder. Behind her, the children still slept, their bodies curled close like puppies under the shared quilt. Clara's fingers clutched a strand of Anna's hair. Nathan had one leg thrown protectively over Tommy. Their faces were calm, untouched by nightmares for once. Evelyn swallowed hard, her throat taut with gratitude. Downstairs, the fire crackled low in the hearth, coaxed alive by Wade before he'd slipped out to tend the horses. The man moved like the land itself, now quiet, enduring, and impossibly strong. Since Cal's departure, Wade had taken to checking the perimeter each morning, not out of fear, but something deeper. A need to protect what they had built. What she had come to believe might be hers too. The cabin door creaked open behind her. She turned. Wade stood there, hat in hand, cheeks ruddy from the chill, and something unreadable in his eyes. "You're up early," he said, voice gravel thick. "Couldn't sleep," she replied softly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. He stepped forward, the worn floorboards groaning beneath his boots. "There's frost coming," he said. "Thought we might move the coop closer to the barn. Give the hens more shelter." Evelyn nodded. That makes sense. But they both knew the words weren't about chickens. Wade set his hat on the table and took a breath. "I was thinking, it might be time to make things more official." Evelyn blinked. "Official?" He moved closer, his voice lower now. "This place, these kids, you and me." Her heart skipped. The walls she'd so carefully built started to tremble. "You don't have to," he added quickly. "You owe me nothing." She reached for his hand before he could say more. "Wade, if I stayed this long, just out of need, I would have left the day Cal was gone. I'm here because this feels like home." His grip tightened gently, and he smiled, that small, rare smile that tugged at the corners of his weather-worn face. They stood together in the soft hush of morning until a thump from upstairs broke the silence. Tommy's laughter followed. The house was waking. By midday, the ranch was alive with motion. The coop had been moved and reinforced, with Clara supervising the placement of nesting boxes, as if she'd built them herself. Wade let her direct, never once correcting her stern little voice. Evelyn watched from the fence, arms crossed and heart swelling. These children, once quiet with fear and hunger, now laughed openly, running from chore to chore with purpose. It was a music she never thought she'd hear. Anna carried a wooden bucket, half her size, sloshing water over her boots. "Mama," she called, "we need a new lid for the grain barrel. A squirrel chewed through it." Evelyn bent to inspect it. "I'll ask Mr. Wade to cut one this evening." Anna's face lit up. "He always knows how to fix things." "He does," Evelyn murmured. Later that afternoon, Wade found her in the kitchen. Sleeves rolled flour, dusting her hairline kneading dough with a rhythm born of repetition and survival. He leaned on the doorframe. "What if we gave this place a new name?" he asked. She looked up. "It has one. Callahan Ranch." That was before. Before it had laughter. Before it had little shoes on the porch and laundry strung like prayer flags across the yard. Maybe it needs a name that reflects what it became. She hesitated, brushing her hand across her apron. And what did it become? He smiled. A home that waited. Evelyn felt her eyes sting. She turned quickly back to the dough. "Then maybe we call it that. The waiting home." He nodded. "Then it's settled." At sunset, they gathered around the fire pit outside. Wade roasted fresh corn on the coals, while Clara read aloud from an old storybook, her voice clear against the hush of dusk. Evelyn sat with Anna in her lap, brushing her curls as the little girl fought sleep. Nathan leaned against Wade's side. "Can we build a treehouse next?" Wade chuckled. "You planning to do the hammering?" "Yep, and the sawing, and the roof." Then, I guess we better start drawing some plans." Evelyn smiled as the boy beamed. She couldn't remember the last time she'd seen him light up like that. When the stars emerged one by one, Wade handed Evelyn a folded piece of parchment. "Something I picked up last time in town." She opened it. A marriage certificate. Her name already written neatly in pen. Her fingers trembled. "If you want," he said simply. Evelyn looked up at him, eyes wide. For so long she had only known men who took, who demanded, who ruled by fists and threats. But here was a man who asked, who waited. "Yes," she whispered. The ceremony was simple. Jed and his wife stood witness in the pasture behind the barn chickens, clucking idly as if given their approval. Clara and Nathan held small wildflower bundles picked fresh from the creek. Evelyn wore a clean dress stitched by Lissa from muslin scraps, her dark hair braided and pinned with 2 tiny yellow blossoms. Wade stood tall beside her, his coat brushed, clean boots polished for the first time in years. Jed opened a small Bible and cleared his throat. "We gather not just to mark a union, but to bless a home already built with love." As they exchanged vows, the sun slipped behind the hills, painting the sky in streaks of lavender and rose. The words were few but true. "I do," Wade said, voice firm. "I do," Evelyn echoed. The children cheered, chickens flapped, and a hawk circled overhead like a benediction from the sky. That night, as the lanterns glowed low and the children settled into their quilts, Evelyn and Wade sat together on the porch swing. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the distance coyotes sang. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. "Not for a second. She shook her head. "It's more than I ever dreamed." "Then let's dream more." She smiled. "All right." Wade reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a carved piece of wood, a sign etched with careful hands. "The Waiting Home." Evelyn traced the letters with her fingertips. "Let's hang it by the gate, for anyone who's still searching." Seasons turned. Snow blanketed the ranch, then melted into wildflower meadows. The children grew taller, stronger, louder. The barn got new shingles. The fields bore healthy crops. And through it all, Evelyn remained the steady center. More children came. Orphans left in baskets. Runaways led by whisper. Word spread. If you were lost, go to the ranch with the woman who never turned a soul away. Evelyn welcomed them all. By the time she turned 50, they had a dozen living under their roof. Everyone knew how to tend the fire braid rope and say grace with full hearts. On her birthday, Clara, now grown and betrothed to the Weaver boy, presented her with a new sign. "It says, 'A place for all who knock,'" Clara explained. Evelyn wept as Wade mounted it above the doorway. Years passed. The ranch grew quieter as children married, settled nearby, or took up ranching of their own. But each Sunday, without fail, they came home. The table always had one more plate. The porch always had space for one more rocking chair. Wade's hair turned silver. Evelyn's steps slowed, but their love never dimmed. It only deepened like roots anchoring a mighty oak. And one crisp autumn evening, as the fire crackled and laughter rose from the kitchen, Evelyn sat with Wade on the porch once more. "You know," he said, resting his hand on hers, "I used to think I was just a man with a barn. But you turned that barn into a cathedral." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "And you gave me a place to stop running." They rocked in silence, hearts full as the moon climbed high. The door behind them creaked open, and Anna, now a mother herself, stepped out. "Ma Papa, the stew's ready." Evelyn smiled. Home, not borrowed, not broken, built, and always waiting.